I just came back from Hades, or what people commonly called hell. It is old, dirty, disgusting, filthy, and not very clean at all, at least in some parts. Others were filled with quagmire that made walking difficult. Some places were wide and open, dark, dusty, and lonely, while others were clean, sterile, and filled with others who knew only what they could touch for themselves. The dream started off with my being sent to look for a friend. Let's call this person Rob. Rob had gone there not realizing where he was, and why I was sent to look for him I had no idea. But the plan was simple: look for him and talk to him about leaving this place. It seemed simple at first, but then I started off on the journey. The landscape was bleak and lifeless, the skies gray and evenly overcast in all directions. From the point where I stood, I could look around in all directions and see that it was all the same. Rolling hills that made climbing up strenuous and walking down difficult, and far off behind them a rocky mountain range. The landscape was threatening. You dare not stay where you were, and yet the distant terrain was far from inviting. But I could not stay in one spot. My insides told me that I should be off looking for my friend. So I started to walk, only to find the surface I was standing on had a hard crust, strong enough to hold firm any stationary object. But it would crack and break with the slightest movement. Underneath the crust was loose sand that slid my feet in opposite directions while I walked, almost as if it were intentionally trying to split me up the middle. The journey was hard and very frustrating, but once I got by the landscape of loose and shifting sand, I made my way to the thick quagmire. Here it was like walking, or trying to walk, through vats of dried porridge, not as thick and immovable as mud, but still just as difficult. Placing one foot in front of the other was easier than moving my body to cover the distance of that foot. It was an excruciatingly long travel, but one that I knew I had to take. Every once in a while I would stop and take a breather, looking around to see not only how far I had come, but how much further I had to go. In my mind, I had lost the real idea of what my goal was. I just knew that I should keep moving forward. It was during one of my breaks I noticed the dark house up ahead. I surmised this was my target, at least a point of reference, something to work for, even if it looked ominous. After exerting much energy, I eventually made it to ground that was actually solid enough to walk on normally. The ground surrounded the dark house and was covered with people cowering and trembling in various places. Some looked up at me with pitiful eyes, screaming out for some sort of hope, but they knew that soon I would discover what they already had. Some of the people didn't even look at me as though I was exactly what they feared. But most people just stayed on the ground in a fetal position, moaning with emotional pain and suffering. As I made my way around the people, I approached the doors of fear and horrors. Here I discovered why all these people lay on the ground. As I neared the door, my worst horrors and fears tried keeping me from entering. Somehow they can read one's heart and mind and will and bring to life exactly what one feared of the most. I surmised it was difficult for each of these people around here. They were not all comfortable with the sand or quagmire, but to them it was better than facing their fears. Then, from within my own heart, came the manifestation of my fears. As I approached the door, several large creatures came at me. They had only faces and a terrifying scream of horror that grew louder as they approached with great speed. I can no longer remember exactly what they looked like, other than frightening, as they tried to physically make contact with me. To me, I foolishly stood my ground. It was then I noticed that it seemed so easy to maneuver around them or just duck out of the way. Once I had faced them, they became far less powerful. Eventually, they stopped altogether. I wished I could have gone back to encourage the people on the ground to face their fears and get out of the cold, but I knew they wouldn't listen. I remembered what I felt when I was in their position. I too felt like giving up and not even trying anymore. Something told me that they wouldn't listen anyway. Their fears would be too great for them to face. I was sad for them. Once inside the house, I made my way up a long set of stairs that led to the first level. Several of my fear creatures made feeble attempts at keeping me out, but they were soon no more. Inside, the walls along the stairs curved around, making it impossible to see what was coming next. I looked behind, and yet again several of my fear creatures made feeble attempts to keep me from climbing the stairs. But they were behind me now. And then I reached the top and looked down a large and long corridor, lonely and filled with sounds of sobbing and sadness and regret. Someone rushed past me and told me I ought to get to school so I could get out of here. I cannot recall who or what this person was, but he was either part of the staff or someone who had just found his way out. I had wondered what he meant and thought about it for a second or two. It was at this point I realized I was in a dream and that I best follow the course of it. I had no idea where to go, so I just walked to one of the many corridors. I eventually found myself in another large, dimly lit hallway with an empty open area that had 4 other connecting hallways, all opposite each other, like a wheel hub with 5 spokes. One of the hallways had a classroom with people in it. Inside, the students were all older people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, but they were dressed as kids, children, and were reciting their opinions, thoughts, feelings about who Jesus Christ was to them. I heard 2 of them. One said, "Jesus is one of my friends," and another said, "Christ is another man and teacher." It seemed to me that these people did not know him at all, and that they could be in school a little while longer, even though they had already been there in the same classroom for decades. But the teacher was patient, and the few empty desks seemed to encourage him. From there, I went to a place that was white, bright, and sterile, but had lots of noisy sand over all the floors. This made it easier for the people to know they were moving and not standing in one spot. It also gave the sterility of the place an unnatural texture, which also came from the art that hung on the walls. At least they called it art. That or other forms of human creation and self-expression. The people there were smart and talked like university students. You know, using big words they had just learned but hadn't worked naturally into their own personal vocabulary. I was fascinated with the place and walked around forgetting why I was in the house in the first place. When I would pass some of the people, they could sense my presence but could not see me, even though they could hear me. For some reason, I felt I should keep from being found out, or at least keep them from knowing that I was there. But why they couldn't see me, I had no idea. On one occasion, I had to hide my presence by standing still when a bunch of giggling girls walked by. When the group of young, similarly dressed schoolgirls passed, I continued on. I made my way upstairs and into a large place with light and many stairs going every which way. An older student, with many other students who listened to her thoughts of the world and the spirit realm around them, seemed to sense my presence and began to talk aloud as though she was addressing a ghost in a seance. I ignored her and decided to be on my way, but the only way I could pass them was to walk up and along one of the art pieces, an awkwardly made shape made from steel and mounted on part of the wall angled at about 45 degrees. As I stepped my foot onto the wall and shape, it caused it to break and crack, thus giving away my whereabouts. The one student talked into the air as if trying to threaten a ghost or spirit by exposing my presence. I thought this funny since they couldn't see me to begin with and yet were going to expose me. I laughed on the inside. Once onto the floor, I quickly left that area, ignoring their ludicrous threats, which seemed to encourage the teacher by convincing the students that she was now an expert on the subject. From there, I found myself in a large and dark waiting station filled with sick and dying people. There were as many kinds of sicknesses as there were injuries as there was suffering. Inside, I wished I could do something, but knew I couldn't. I looked up to the very high ceiling and could see blue sky shining through as if it were a bright sunny day out. I looked about and could tell that I was the only one who noticed it. From there, I made my way into a smaller area that contained people in beds. This place had a lot of support pillars built into its design, and there were many other staff members attending the patients. This room seemed to be filled with people getting better. Those who had come from the waiting station to this room, the recovery room. It was brought to my attention, but how and by whom I no longer recall, that I needed a manual to get out of the house. To me, this seemed irrelevant, as I already knew how to leave, for I was only there to see a friend and bring him out. I was given a picture in my head that in one of the rooms in this house, there was a closet with thousands of boxes of manuals. But that was when the house was first established. By now, the number of manuals was down to a few hundred. And once they were gone, there would be no way for these people to find their way out. I hoped inside that those who knew how to get out would help those still trying to find their way, even though they didn't have a manual. I started searching the recovery room when I met someone who seemed like my brother Ben. He searched with me for a while, then disappeared somewhere in the room. I felt he was busy and of no use in the room, not a patient, but more as one of the staff. As I quickly walked the area, my attention was grabbed by Rob. He was dressed all in black, but it was not the Rob I remember at all. But still, it was him, though he looked very different. He smiled and asked me what I was doing there. I explained that I had come to bring him out of the house, but he told me that he was happy there just helping the others. We talked for a time while he showed me around the place explaining things. Then we made our way to one of the food carts being wheeled around the room. He told me that if I wanted to leave the house, I would have to eat of the desserts it held. I looked inside and found them visually unappealing and had to coax myself into getting a plate and spoon. I hesitantly scooped up something resembling hard-dried custard out of the sand-like chopped nuts, and eventually worked up enough courage to bring the spoonful to my mouth. But to my surprise and newfound joy, this dessert was delicious. I was thankful that I did not need to eat any more, for that one spoonful seemed to fill me right up. And once again, to my surprise, I looked back to the dessert and now found that it appeared brighter and more visually appetizing. The food in the cart was beautiful now, and it was just one taste that was needed to open up one's eyes. It was then I realized, to me, that a tiny bit was all I needed, and that various other people needed various other amounts. Then Rob pointed out 2 more devices I needed before I was able to leave. One, a thin metal harness that fit over my shoulders and back like a hiker's backpack. I found it to be so heavy, so much so I let it rest on the cart while the other device was wheeled over. It was a tray filled with many white glowing balls, each the size of a bowling ball and about as heavy. But to the nurse carrying it, it seemed as light as an empty tray. I took one of the burdensome balls and held it up against my shoulders while I reached over and grabbed the metal yoke-like device. Then I was instructed to put the ball into the harness. When I did so, both became so incredibly light, and once it was on my back, it felt like nothing at all. Rob told me that the bus was here, and I had to get on it or it would go without me. Another one would not be by for a very long time, as they knew it was always a long time before people being healed enough to leave the house. Also, the drivers were very precise about their schedule. I urged Rob again to come along, but he would have none of it. His place was helping out there, at least for now, I sensed. Then I walked over to the loading platform and looked out over the country. It was still vast and filled with hills and valleys barren of life and vegetation. The platform attached to the house was miles from the ground, and the bus seemed to be somehow floating there. I looked inside and saw room for only 8 passengers. 7 of the places were already taken, and mine waited for me. As I got into the rather cramped quarters, I noticed that our harnesses neatly attached to the insides, securing us from any rough motion should we encounter such. Once I was in, I thought the door would close and we'd be off, since it was full. But the driver, who waited on the platform, looked at his watch and said we still had a few minutes, and always room for one more. I looked out and hoped I would see Rob coming to join us. Then the door of the bus started to close and the dream began to fade.